Okay, let's get started, everyone. It's 7:01. Late. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we gather on the traditional lands for the Kaurna people and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Greater Adelaide region and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. This budget debrief session has been convened for the purpose of debriefing of the 2023-24 budget process. This session will be used solely for the purposes of information sharing and not for the purposes of debating issues, building consensus positions or otherwise discharging Council's deliberative and decision-making functions. We have no members of the Community Gallery. However, if people do present, I'm sure they'll all be respectful, so I don't need to say anything more about that. We don't have any set agenda and we don't take minutes. That will be taken during this session. So I might hand over to Sharon Perkins now, who has a presentation. There's quite a few slides, and we'll see how we go.
Thank you, Mayor Redman, and welcome members, and thank you for those members that have actually provided some feedback in relation to some of the items that we're actually discussing tonight. So obviously, as the Mayor mentioned, the purpose of this is to debrief on the 23-24 budget process and just go through a few items that have been raised by members in relation to that process. So the discussion points that were forwarded through cover off basically the project bids, so that's the capital and new initiatives, project carry forwards, depreciation, long-term planning and rates. So I've sort of tried to go through and sort of consolidate the issues that were raised. So hopefully I've interpreted all the issues that were raised by members, but feel free to actually add points if you don't think that I've covered it enough. Oh, got to get my fingers right. So the first topic is project bids. So obviously our project bids, we use our project bid form to actually make submissions with regard to our capital works program and also our new initiatives. So capital works forms our capital budget, and then the new initiatives projects form part of our overall operating budget. So there's in preparing the project bids, there's premises that effectively staff follow, that all the project bids should be in line with the council strategy plan, either a legislative requirement or a risk or a hazard reduction. And when the projects are actually evaluated from an executive perspective, it's some of these criteria that we actually make that assessment against. One thing that we didn't necessarily use this year, so obviously this was my first budget process, and I came in once the process had actually commenced, so there was some aspects that I just went with, but there's a few things that I suppose from my perspective going through the process here at the town of Gawler are probably going to introduce some different concepts and approaches as we go through to the 24-25 budget cycle, which will soon commence. So in relation to one of the things that I've used in the past, especially with the capital works projects, because obviously that's a big amount of money that we spend, and we do have limited resources, is just having a ranking or a scoring system of those projects. So effectively we're making sure that the projects that are actually being put forward are those ones that are actually highest priority, and pretty much have already been considered in the chamber by the council, either through the long-term financial plan. It might be one of the major projects that we've identified in the long-term financial plan, or the asset management plans. Overall, it needs to contribute to the goals set out in the community plan. So effectively that community plan 2030 is what guides us. So those projects that are put for consideration are put there. Or it might actually be an action item to actually to deliver on an existing corporate plan or strategies, like the Climate Emergency Action Plan, Dog and Cat Management Act plan, disability. Obviously the risk component, and then whether it's actually a legislative requirement. So that's something that we'll introduce. So when the projects come to the chamber, we would have actually already ranked against the scoring criteria. So one of the some of the feedback that came from Councillor Hennessy was the position of just having the summary document of the project. She didn't feel it was actually sufficient to give her enough information to actually make an assessment or have an understanding of what was actually being asked for within the project summary. So the picture here on the screen is basically a bid form that staff members all fill out. So that provides the detail. This is just the first page. It basically provides the costing, it provides a risk assessment, and sets out the linkages to the actual the community plan, whether there's any other plan.
Yeah, Sharon, with those 5 criteria, are they weighted and are they in order of importance?
They will be weighted, so that and effectively, so pretty much it's used as a scoring of 1 to 5, and then it's weighted. And so again, that's just listed as they came out of my head, and all that sort of stuff. So that's not in the order of. But they will be weighted, obviously, because some things are more important than others, and that we'll just work through that criteria. So going back to the project bid form, what I've done in past at previous councils is we have also provided the summary, so the spreadsheet, which basically lists on a couple of pages lists all the projects. But we've also included in the attachments basically the funding submissions that are actually being submitted by staff. So if council members want actually additional information, they can actually refer back to the funding submission to gather that additional information if that's what they require. So that's one solution that we can actually provide to actually give you more information rather than providing the detail up front. It's just more as a reference point. Yes, Councillor Hennessy, you look like you.
I was just going to say how you're going to do that, because my understanding is it's an automated system that goes from that form into a spreadsheet. So if I see a particular spreadsheet and think that looks interesting, I might want more detail, can it be linked back to the original form somehow?
So I would probably not necessarily put it back into a spreadsheet, see if we can actually print it up as a form, and then ideally, so very similar to what, very similar concept to sit there and say, and effectively the spreadsheet or the summary sheet is actually hyperlinked, so you can click on that and then refer to. So those sorts of things are making it easy as possible for you. Obviously, that only works for those members that actually want has it electronically. Obviously, if those with paper will have to flick through all the funding submissions. So that's one solution which I'd propose to actually introduce this year. It does mean that you are actually going to get a lot more content, but obviously it's your choice as to whether you actually want to refer to it or not, but that information will be there. And effectively, so the comment was also in relation to the new staff and not understanding the new staff. So the new staff actually also have to, requests for the new positions also have to go through this process as well, so you'll have that information as well.
Just in regards to elected member bids, I do recall basic, oh, you're going to get to it?
I'm somebody at the moment who does do paper. I'm I'll be fast moving back to electronic. There are some times I want to be able to read in depth, so the option to print out is useful. But I mean, I've brought my folder today. That's just a portion of what we got hit with. So it's not a lack of information, it's just being able to access it as necessary, I get. Rather than give an avalanche of paper, I like your idea. I think being able to say, this I want to dig down on because I need more information, or I don't understand. So I like that idea of selectively and then encouraging us to be able to do it ourselves. And that will save, I presume, quite a bit on the staff, leaving it to almost to the end of the process, that if I can't find anything right to the end, then I can come to staff and ask for more detail. My comment about the staffing is that my question said more detailed justification with evidence of, I guess, the latest staffing reviews. So we're on the outside and not understanding what the plans for staffing changes or staffing replacement or whatever. It's not our role to make that, it's the CEO's, but some clarification of where this role fits in and why an additional position is needed there and why it can't be moved from another part of the organisation or, wait until somebody retires or whatever. That's the type of level of information I'm looking for.
Yep, that's fine. We'll take that on notice. So basically that's from those two issues with regard to the information that's actually provided in that within the budget or the considerations of the projects. So with regard to council member project bids, probably would be recommending that effectively council members also have to fill out that form rather than the simple one-page form that effectively was provided previously, because realistically the council, for the council to actually make an evaluation of those council member project bids alongside the staff submissions, that information actually needs to be provided as well. So, with respect to, Deputy Mayor Shanks put a comment in relation to the resolution that was passed as part of the last council in relation to this 1% allocation based on expenditure to be allocated to council member project bids. It was interesting. I had a catch up with some colleagues on last week, and I was mentioning that I was doing this session, and one of my colleagues said, in their mandatory training session, the presenter said that basically council members shouldn't actually be putting in project bids because effectively, so that was that position, because it's actually making sure that effectively because of the requirement for projects to be linking back to strategy and the plans and all that sort of stuff, realistically, most of those bids that should be put forward should be covered off. But that was her position, because she felt as though it wasn't necessarily that position.
I actually don't agree with that.
Well,
I think that traditionally at the town of Gawler we've always had council member bids, and I think some of them aren't very expensive, some of them are, and I think they're valid if they're provided with enough evidence to support the bid. Yeah, so sorry, Sharon, but I don't agree with that.
I'm just passing comment to sit there and say that was one of the positions from that part coming from the mandatory training. So there is this resolution said that effectively 1% of expenditure As I said, you know, council members may submit project bids for consideration. Obviously, with the there will be that requirement to actually probably provide a bit more detail, so the information is provided. Depending on the nature of the projects, obviously it would be funded either between new initiatives. It's a new initiative, so it's funded by rate revenue. If it's capital projects, it's funded by borrowings. As I said, council members, which has been pretty much past practice, is considered along with all the project proposals submitted by staff, and obviously considered by merit in the context of the capital budget and the new initiatives budget. And then the same scenario is that the merit would be based on a priority ranking. Obviously, the requirement for council member bids probably is a bit more detailed, so do recommend that the council members speak to the respective executive manager to actually get some assistance to actually provide in completing that funding submission.
Who does the priority ranking?
So that would be done effectively as the executive team, along with the... so elected member bids would actually go into the pool with all the staff bids, and then they'll actually get ranked, and then all of them presented based on their ranking.
No, thank you for that. And look, to be honest, Sharon, I actually don't disagree with the sentiment that you put forward from the opinion put forward. However, that would mean that the budget suits everything that the elected members think should be in it. Unfortunately, in my experience, each budget cycle is lacking a few things, so elected members take their right as the Board of Directors to move motions to put those things forward. I guess what Councillor Goldstone was trying to do, I've just got his email up here from, when was this, 2021. The reason he moved the motion was because historically we had this, well, if you're going to spend this money, we need to find savings here, etc., etc. So which, don't get me wrong, is a right thing. However, quarantining it is exactly what he was saying. So don't spend 1% or allocate 1% to all these other project bids until elected members have put forward their bids, if any, and then it would go back into the pool for other bids. So I guess the reason I flagged that is, what is the function that we can ensure that motion's upheld? Because that hasn't been rescinded in any way. That's still a live motion. We sort of glossed over it in this budget process, and look, I'm happy to accept it because new chamber, everything like that. But what can we do to cement that process in? Because I think it was a good process in the budget, because we're not playing a drop this so we can put this, which was the intent of the motion. Noting you weren't here for those conversations, which I also put forward.
Fundamentally, if we quarantine a portion of the budget for council member bids, effectively out of the big bucket, there is going to have to be what's going to drop out as a result of that. So I suppose the starting point for which I would sit there and say from a budgeting perspective, especially in relation to capital, is effectively what's set out in the asset management plan, and if there's any strategic projects that are actually set out and due to be delivered from the long-term financial plan or any other plan. So while I understand the intent, but fundamentally there is always going to be a trade-off if effectively you're going to quarantine $300,000 or $400,000 or $500,000 of the budget for specifically for the consideration in council members' bids. Because effectively that basically says to me that as council members, you're putting priority on your own bids over all the other bids that are actually being submitted, and I don't necessarily agree that that's actually the intent of the process of actually considering and assessing all the project submissions or funding submissions on a merit basis.
So,
that's my...
Yeah, no, and I don't disagree with that. This was a decision in 2021. This isn't a decision that we're going to make. If we need to relook at the process, absolutely, let's have a look and let's have a discussion, which I think this debrief we're able to unpack. It's just, this was the direction of the chamber at the time. And I'm just saying, if we're going to quarantine, then we need to understand what that means, because 1% was going to be earmarked from 2021 for elected member bids. Not to say we're going to spend all that money, that was never the intent, but it was to say, hey, let's approach elected members and see what bids are on the table while we're starting the initial conversation. That's what the intent of this was.
I tend to agree with Deputy Mayor Shanks. That was the intent of the 1%. It's not a case that we would spend the 1%, and I don't think we've ever gone up to that much. I think we, you know, if you look at the previous budget process, we dissected the budget very carefully, and we looked at every bid in I think a lot of detail. Now I know some members want more detail, and that's fair enough. So I think that if we use that same rigour going through budget bids and using the rankings, using the evidence that's put forward for each bid, I think we can't go wrong. And I think our bids are just as important as staff bids. However, I do take Sharon's point that that it might be asset management plan, because we are required to deliver on the asset management plan. We're also required to deliver on our community plan, if at all possible. So there's links of how we justify a bid. And I agree that if a ranking comes back for a particular bid, say one of your bids, Nathan, and it's below the line, we'd say, well, why is that below the line? What process did you go through? How did you rank it? Was there enough information, etc., etc.? I completely get that. I think that our bids are no more important than staff bids. However, I agree with you, sometimes there are little gaps, and I think that's the role of a community representative to say, well, how about that, or how about that? And I think, we've never spent the 1% ever, so.
And if you remember, Mayor, we've also used the 1% to actually resurrect staff member bids that ended up below the line as well. This is a worthy project. Hey, we don't think this should be below the line this year, and put it forward. Decision makers, we have to checks and balances. That 1% just allowed us to operate in that realm, because again, the projects we're putting forward aren't massive in most cases.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Look, I quite like the idea of everybody, when they do a bid, elected members, that we go through and we look at strategically look at it and how it fits in, and then it's ranked and weighted. I think that is the way to go. Instead of just putting up bids, lobbying us and hoping to get it up, isn't very strategic and is not a good way of spending money. So I think this system, where we can put up bids, we have to go through the same system, it gets ranked, get weighted, etc., and that way it's a strategic decision, not a political decision.
I think that's right, and I said before that I think Sharon's got on the money with enough evidence, ranking, and on merit. But it has to be linked to the strategic documents, because if it's not, what are we doing? What are we doing? So I don't think anyone disagrees with that. Councillor Hennessy.
Yeah, I hear what's being said, and as an observer rather than a member of the council, my interpretation is that the elected members didn't feel they were getting a reasonable hearing about some of their bids. But I do take the point that I'm concerned with the motion that stands, because I think it could be misused, and therefore a demand could be made that all elected members up to 1% will go through. So I think, I take advice, and perhaps Sharon would like to.
I think that's why we have this debrief, and I think just thrashing that out, that idea of our bids somehow more important. I don't believe our bids are more important than staff bids. I think we're all on the same page. But if we put up a bid, if I put up a bid, if you put up a bid, Mick, it needs to have the evidence and it needs to be connected to a strategic plan. 1 or 2 strategic plans, I don't know. But there needs to be strong, robust evidence, just like staff do. Staff do exactly the same thing. Now, we might get assistance from staff. We're allowed to ask for assistance from staff, and I think that that may be a good use of staff resource to make sure our bids are robust enough to stand scrutiny.
In relation to your Helen, I must admit I probably concur with you, Helen, as well as to sit there and say I read the resolution a number of times and I didn't necessarily understand what was resolved. I've read the report that supports this resolution, and the report actually does emphasise the fact that it's still merit-based, it's still consistent with past practices, all of that. Yes, they can submit it, but effectively it is merit-based, and then effectively if you just put this notional figure. The question I have...
Yeah, just a couple of things. I think I think it would be good if we had a system in place where when we wanted to have a bid, there was a conversation with a relevant person who could help go through exactly where it fits strategically. Because I've never seen an elected member bid that wasn't in our strategic goals. You know, obviously we don't necessarily have the words for it, but every elected member bid I've ever seen has been aligning with our community plan and all these kinds of things. But I think having that transparency of, well, why is it relevant to our strategic plan sort of protects it from, you know, maybe an attack of, oh, well, it's just elected members, you know, making their own decisions. So I think that would be good. But yeah, I just think it's, I guess around the why that motion was there in the first place. I think there was a sort of frustration around the elected members would come in at like May of the process after everything had been finalised essentially, and sort of, you know, here you can put something up, and it's like, well, what would you want to cut? And it's like, well, how would we possibly know? You haven't given us, I don't know whether this infrastructure project can be $50,000 cheaper or anything like that. And so there was sort of a, you know, give some buffer for the community, because we're not, you know, I fully understand why staff would be frustrated at the idea of elected members being the ones to make the decision as just random community members, you know, in that sense. But like, that's why this process exists, is because community members having oversight is the purpose of a council. And sometimes something comes through in the budget process or in the reviews, in the community feedback, and we need to be able to adjust things because this is a community organisation.
Which is a wonderful segue to my next suggestion, is that we need a timeline so that we don't come on. I mean, newly elected member, I think we were hit November, and it didn't stop until June. Having some understanding of the timeline, which then also encourages us to put in our bids early in the process rather than May, would give us all, I think, some comfort in that. But I still go back to, I hear what everyone's saying, and I know we have some verbal agreement now. I still think there is a risk that that motion as it stands can be misused to push the political and the popular projects ahead of less sexy things that are in the long-term financial plan, and I can probably name a couple of projects if you really want to. So Sharon, if we can tighten that somehow, or some understanding in writing, so that there's no misunderstanding in the next budget that, hang on, my project needs to get in because we're not yet up to 1%. I don't want to see that happen again, because that's not the idea.
It's never happened. It's never happened. No. And not in my time, and I don't think in your time either. Yeah, you want to speak?
Just to be clear, whether or not we agree with the motion that was adopted in 2021, at this point in time, that's a live motion. I'm more than happy to work as a team to figure out how we can tighten up the process. However, the intent of the motion was pretty clear. Flagging, yes, absolutely, Sharon, you've come in and trying to interpret something and playing catch-up, which I did note that in the email. But at this point in time, the wording sits the way the wording sits. So the process that we've used in the past with that quarantined, I think, still stands, unless I'm wrong. We need an alternative that we all agree to. Until that time, this is currently what we have on there, and I haven't seen any elected members use that to suit their own personal agendas. And like Councillor Davies pointed out, every project that I've ever seen put forward fits into the community plan one way or another. Which I thank Sharon for, is the first time I'm actually starting to understand the process of how staff put their bids in, and I completely agree. We should be putting in bids the same way. And to be honest, this is a process that I think some elected members have been putting forward for a number of years on trying to say, hey, can we get into the conversation early in the piece? Because we feel like the conversations are done when we're brought in. This debrief is a good part of that. So, I thank Sharon for the information, and I completely agree that the form should be consistent. We should be following the same process as a team instead of, trying to wedge something in there, which is that 1%, is that buffer where we quarantine for that reason.
I think you go back to the point that our bids are no more important than staff bids. If we take that premise, I think we can't go wrong. And I like the idea of a rating to just see where it fits, just to see where it sits with the long-term financial plan, where it sits with the asset management plan, where it sits with the community plan, or the climate emergency plan, whatever the plan might be. I think it's really important that we understand that our bids are no more important than anybody else's. And I think that sometimes we think our bids are more important, but they're not. I don't think we should ever think that, and that goes to the heart of that ranking system. So I'll hand back to Sharon and we'll keep moving, I think.
So just in relation to comments from your Councillor Hennessy, so effectively, so the way that I've managed council member bids, like even though those comments at the start from whether council members should put bids in or not, that was feedback that I've got. So I've always worked with council members actually providing bids, and I've always worked on the scenario that effectively council member bids work on the same time frame as staff members. So effectively, process is to sit there and say, so a timetable would be given, and a timetable was given as part of the January report. I get the fact that you were just on council and it was a bit overwhelming and all that sort of stuff. So the normal process is that a timetable, which will actually set out pretty much indicative times of when council would actually be considering items of the budget. One of the things I thought were a bit strange coming here, but I didn't push it too much, was the fact that you're actually considering your budgets before you're actually considering your current budget, which actually makes it really hard because effectively your current budget, which is your business as usual budget, is fundamental, and I think you should actually be setting that first, because then that actually allows you to identify, so you can give, so at that point in time, based on those expenses or the expenditure that's required to actually continue to do the existing services that we provide, can give you an indication of what sort of rate revenue increase that you'll actually be looking for to actually ensure that you can actually deliver a surplus. And then that also gives you a bucket of funds, especially from a new initiatives perspective, is to sit there and say, actually, realistically, with this rate revenue increase, and this is the expenditure, this is really from how much you've actually got left to actually introduce new initiatives, do new services and all that sort of stuff without actually having to increase rates further. Or if you actually want to do all these sorts of things, and we might be subject to cyclical expenses, and I'll go through that a bit further later on, you know, so this is the bucket that you've got. So you've actually got that self-constraint from a staff perspective, but also from a collective perspective as well, as to sit there and say, oh, actually, well, realistically, you know, do we need this? Do we have to do that? What do we actually have to change? So that would be one change that I would be recommending, in the sense that we do our recurrent budget first, understand what our majority of our expenses are, because our recurrent budget actually represents around about 95% of the total expenses. So from that perspective. And normally, so I just need to work out from a timing perspective, but effectively when we actually go out for the call to staff, we're actually going out to the call to elected members. And we did that this year round, so effectively there was an email to sit there and say, oh, actually, if you, council members, if you wanted to put a submission in, you needed to put it in, I think, by early February, mid-February, so we could actually put it all into the mix, and so they're all considered together.
But unless things have changed radically, the last quarter of this year, staff are starting to prepare their submissions. They're given quite a bit of time to get their information together. Telling us, you know, February without the similar lead time is possibly not the best way to go, I suggest. So perhaps, you know, some early warning of the timetable will be looking like this, and your submissions will be needed by February. You might need to start talking to whichever executive it is in this last quarter, perhaps.
I'd be sitting there saying, effectively, members, to sit there and say, if you want to put a submission in, start thinking about it now, realistically, because the timetable's not going to change very much from that perspective, other than the fact that we will be, from a council perspective, you'll be considering that you'll be getting the recurrent budget before you actually get the project. So from that perspective, and realistically, you can start your submissions from tomorrow if you want. It's not gonna be any skin off our nose if you actually make a submission and we receive it before we actually call it or consider it, and all that sort of stuff as well. So you know, realistically, it's just the same as, like, yes, staff might be starting to present to do the submissions, but we haven't actually made a call, you know, in that sense. So we will sort of sit there and say, okay, well, probably come, you know, early December, we'll sit there and say, okay, well, let's start working on them over Christmas, if you're still here in Christmas, and then, because we'll actually start consolidating those processes and doing that review come January. So
Oh, Nathan. All right. So my question, I guess, is just this new process where we have the recurring budget first. Is that something that, does that require a motion of the council or something, or is that just something that the staff can implement?
no, you don't need a motion. So to do that. So effectively, it's just the question of, you know, we're starting looking at that now. But the timetable, so the timetable that comes back in the report to, I think it's normally the January meeting, which basically sets out that process from that perspective. But even the timetable is not a motion of council, because effectively the problem with you adopting a timetable, if something goes wrong, then the motion has to actually be rescinded, which causes a problem. So effectively, it's just more from an information report to sit there and say, okay, well, this is the approach that's actually going to be taken, and this is the indicative timetable, because there's things that come up, you know, that potentially makes it very hard to hit that timetable and those meetings and all that.
Sometimes you've got to move things around, as we know. you know, things aren't perfect. So, yeah, sometimes we have to move things around. So, Nathan?
Just on so putting up bids, which I'm all for members thinking about it earlier. I guess in the past I've seen some double ups, which has been good because staff are putting forward similar bids that you want to put forward. It's just there's a bit of time that goes into elected members' bids as staff bids. Personally, I think I've moved more staff bids above the line than I have my own bids, well, way more in that space. So I guess indicatively knowing what the new projects are on a list would actually undo a whole bunch of work that you actually don't need to embark on if staff have it in hand. So how do we manage that? Because it's always the chicken and egg sort of thing I've noticed.
That's why I suggest that council members should discuss their projects with the executive managers, because effectively most of the executive managers know what staff are actually going to submit or what's actually on the agenda before you actually go to too much effort into actually preparing it. You know, just pick up the phone, have a conversation and saying, oh, you know, I'm thinking about doing this. And realistically, we would sit there and say, oh, okay, well, don't worry, it's already on our radar, or it's not on our radar, and then we'll basically work with you. Same scenario. And I think it is really important, and that final comment about making sure that you discuss what you're thinking about putting in prior to actually filling out the form, just to have that understanding, because effectively some of the stuff as well is having that discussion with the executive manager up front. We can actually put our thinking hat on and then start the ball rolling on trying to work out from a costing perspective of realistically how much funding actually should be allocated to the bid. But it's a bit hard for us to actually do that after the fact. So yeah, so have the conversation would be my suggestion from that perspective.
Yeah, just further to the conversation and the various elements, I think what we'll do is that we'll consolidate the feedback. I think we'll put together a sort of a protocol for elected member bids. We'll get that documented sooner rather than later. We'll introduce some timeframes and some, the templates and the criteria that would otherwise use. And then I think your suggestion, Nathan, was probably also no double up within the members in terms of ideas. So how we might have an initial sort of brief field of information that individual members might present to us, a heading and a couple of paragraphs, circulate that around, and or have a system that people are aware of the conversations and ideas that are floating around, such that, if Mick's got an idea and actually Brian's got the same idea, I think what you're suggesting is, well, let's not double up.
Mine was also with staff as well, because there's been a lot of great staff bids that haven't even made it to here, that we're trying to move bids, and it's like, oh, hang on a minute. If you scroll back through, this one is so deep in here, that actually does pick up what we're trying to do. But to Helen's point, you're not 100% sure that it is exactly what you're talking about because you haven't got the back end of the bid as well. So, yeah, absolutely. Let's have a conversation early on with those execs. But, yeah, making that transparent will stop another elected member doing the same work, efficiencies.
Yeah, I've just looked at, I'm just maybe sharing with the numbers. If 90% is recurrent, and then on a previous budget that would have been 420,000, that would have only been $4.2 million left over for new initiatives. The 1% is on the total budget, not on the budget that really we should be looking at. So that's actually 10% of the amount that's for new initiatives, not 1%, because it's actually more than when we think, because the elected members is 10% of what's available, not 1% of the whole budget. So I think that needs to be looked at. Is that right?
So this is my next slide. Oh. Good segue.
All right, I haven't read it, but...
So effectively and this is where I sort of sit there and think, So what was the intent of the resolution? Was it for capital projects only or both capital and initiatives? Because effectively it depends on that because it does have different implications. So based on the way the resolution is written, and you took at the 23-24 expenditure budget, the notional allocation I would sit there as a starting point for next financial year is 420 as the straight interpretation of that motion. And so then I put questions as to sit there and say, so should the allocation be based on total expenditure, which actually also includes one-off project spend, so it effectively includes the initiatives that are included in the operating budget, and is it inclusive or exclusive of depreciation and interest as well? So taking the 23-24 budget, effectively there was $5.3 million worth of initiative spend, hence why the notional allocation as the strict interpretation of that resolution gives the 420. Depreciation and interest is $8 million. Recurrent budget exclusive of depreciation and interest is around about 28 million. My personal recommendation up there is that if, as a figure for council member bids in that resolution, I would sit there and say it should actually probably be 1% of your current budget exclusive depreciation and interest. And that just basically takes into account your ongoing operational budgets, your base services, effectively labour and materials. You know, and then there will be this consistency between each year rather than you're actually saying 1 year because you've got a lot of initiatives because of particular spend or what's actually happening that you've got allocating this more amount, and then next year. Pretty much the mix around that, and effectively that was the interpretation I took of the motion for this year's budget for the 23-24, and it was around about 280,000 for a collective. So it is 1%, but it depends on what 1% of what, and that's where I think that realistically it should probably only be the recurrent budget. It shouldn't take into account new initiatives, and then I don't think it should actually be a share of your depreciation and interest expense, which is heavily influenced by the fact that we're a growth council and our depreciation can jump up quite significantly, especially when we actually have receipting of a whole heap of new assets. From that perspective. And then this year, you know, from an interest perspective, you know, we've gone from 2% interest rates to 6.5% interest rate. So our interest rate for nothing is actually going to be more higher cost. So if you still wanted to have this 1%, again, probably question whether it's necessarily to have a figure, a specified figure, considering that the intent is that council members' bids are put in the pool with all, and that you're looking at what your overall budget perspective is in comparison to, or it's a merit selection on them all. But
what do members think of that recommendation? Oh, Councillor Davey. Yeah,
I mean, I wouldn't mind just, I guess, keeping in mind that it's not as clear-cut as I think my motion last year was around increasing the recurring budget for the participatory budgeting. So that didn't go into the capital initiatives or anything in the first place. So that's, you know, and a lot of the time, as the Deputy Mayor said, a lot of the stuff we're moving around isn't elected members' bids. It's bringing up staff bids above the line or putting staff bids below the line is the majority of the changes that we make. So, you know, I don't mind if it's, you know, a specific amount, but just, I guess, clarifying that it's not a pool of a certain amount of money for elected members to have, you know, that much. It's you know, it's a bubble to say, well, this, we need flexibility. We never use the amount. Some of our bids might be around increasing or reducing the recurrent budget.
Yeah.
But so it's not an exact science, but yeah.
Nathan?
Yeah, look, I'm not necessarily against the recommendation. Moving forward, personally, I'd like to see a report come up to the elected body that gives us a couple of options. This may be one. Another one might be a set amount. Another one, we just tease it out like this. I mean, obviously, this is the first time I'm hearing of this particular option, but I completely agree that the interpretation, we need to tighten that up, because some of the interpretation has, I think, is not quite capturing the intent of Councillor Goldstone's. And again, I don't say that with you're wrong, Councillor Goldstone was right, and whatever else. That's neither here nor there, and I completely accept that the wording can be interpreted either way, and I think we really need to tighten that up, because come next budget process, I don't want to be arguing about this, obviously. No. We need to be clear on what is available as elected members, and the merit-based stuff, I think, is exactly what we're doing anyway, because the only way our budget bid staff or elected members gets endorsed is with the vote of the chamber. So, it does pass that merit test as well. So, yeah, look, I'm not against this, and I think we need to have a further conversation when we see the report come up with the recommendations moving forward.
Any other comments, Councillor Solomon?
Just a question. I mean, has the amount that is allocated for elected member bids ever been exceeded or even come close to?
No.
No, because I mean,
The problem we've got is the wording of the resolution is a little bit vague.
Yeah. I mean, I just had thought that, if you've got a high number of new initiatives that you're spending on in a given year, I assume that would generally follow with the kind of economic conditions or other infrastructure that's going on in the town. So it makes sense as it is. But then again, like, if it's not like that money's actually being expended. So, if we're not even reaching close, then it really doesn't matter how it's calculated, because if it's 280,000, we're still only putting in $60,000 worth of bids, then that's just more consistent from a financial planning perspective, because we know what it's going to be every year before we, get the final budget.
And I think that comment just confers to me is to sit there and say, effectively, council member bids get assigned, so why do you need a number? But anyway, I think we've discussed it enough and all that sort of stuff. So obviously when the first budget paper comes up, we'll have that included in the report. So the next topic is carry forwards. So obviously there's a perception that we actually have a big carry forward project budget. I just want to point out, as to sit there and say, just because we've got a carry forward budget doesn't actually mean that projects are actually lagging behind time. More often it just represents that timing difference between effectively the work being done and actually being invoiced for the work by the supplier. So, for the works. I would sit there and say the graph sort of indicates that there's not really a big carry forward budget issue. Yes, we accept the fact that 23-24 we actually do have a big one, and I'll hand over to Wendy in a moment so she can sort of explain some of those things. But obviously the amount of carry forward depends on the nature of the projects that are actually being done in a given year and the complexity of them, So while there's always in the intent that projects run smoothly, some projects are quite complex and some projects will take a long time to do. And some of them, we, for the best intent, we don't actually have it. So that doesn't mean that there's any fundamental problem. I think the biggest issue is if there was massive carry forward in your operating or your new initiatives, which you basically don't have in this council. So new initiatives, if new initiative spend is being put in the operating budget, effectively, majority of that pretty much gets spent. Obviously, over the last 2 years, the economic conditions have been absolutely horrendous. This council is not alone with regard to the supply chain issues. And sometimes we actually do make some strategic decisions as to why we shouldn't actually be doing a project this particular year. You know, so I know that from Norwood we had we carried forward a reseal budget on a particular street for probably 18 months. But that was actually an intended decision because we were actually doing a major upgrade. So we actually wanted to incorporate those works together because it actually made more sense from a delivery perspective. We could actually get it for a more cost-effective price, and it was actually more community benefit because you don't want to go into reseal a road and then 6 months later dig it up because you're actually doing extra work in there. So there may be some strategic decisions. Having said that, we do understand that effectively it is an issue and it does have implications for the budgeting process. And one of the processes that we actually did this year was for some of those big projects, we did identify that was actually unlikely that we were going to commence the work this year, but effectively we were actually going to be doing the work over 2 years. And we actually presented those projects that we anticipate that those works are actually going to be delivered over 2 years. So that's pretty much the planning approach that we're now adopting, you know, in particular for those major and complex projects. So, you know, there will be a planning process that, you know, effectively it might be a 2 or 3 year program. You start with your concept, and then you do your consultation, and then you do your design. Might do concept and design in 1 year, and then effectively it may sit there because we might actually need funding, or then it will go into the construction. So we'll actually start planning that. And again, Wendy will probably go into a bit more detail. And then obviously the ranking of the projects as well is that we will make sure that we're actually got those priority projects and effectively making sure that we're not doing too many big complex projects in 1 year, you know, and basically set the program that's what's realistic from not only a financial perspective, but also what we've got from a resource perspective. And then this is the other thing about the fact of, you know, that, and this will actually create that increased discipline that we're actually only undertaking capital projects which actually have been identified in an asset management plan or a long-term financial plan. So we've actually got that greater discipline, and realistically that discipline needs to come from staff, but it also needs to come from the chamber as well, making sure that, and recognising that we can't do everything at the same time. And the other big thing, obviously grant money has dried up, but if grant money does come up, realising that when grant money is available, we should actually be looking at existing projects and using that grant money to fund, to reduce the level of borrowings that council actually has to undertake if we can actually do for that grant funding. And pick projects that are already planned for. So we might bring projects forward, you know, we might bring them projects forward 12 months. We probably shouldn't be bringing projects forward 10 years. So we actually don't necessarily, once we've actually adopted the work program, we're not adding new projects to that work program, because effectively funding grant or grants always have funding agreements that always have delivery schedules that are actually attached to them that need to be met. So what actually happens then is that the new project comes on board and then other projects get bumped because we actually have to deliver it, because we've actually initially gone through the budget process and made a recommendation to council to sit there and say this is the amount of works that we can, with the resources, with the current economic conditions and all that sort of stuff, these are the amount of projects that we can actually deliver in the 12-month period. So I'll just hand over to Wendy and she can just do her bit.
Thank you, Sharon. Look, I'm going to try and keep this fairly brief. I think most people in this chamber already know that it has been a tough economic climate for the last couple of years. But the graph you saw from Sharon on the slide before with that, there's this big peak in capital carry forward from last financial year. I just need to set the scene a little bit about what happened at the beginning of last financial year. 2 weeks before end of financial year, the person in my position quit. I had no team leader, no manager, no senior strategic planner, and no senior project engineer because they had all left. We literally turned over 80% of our infrastructure staff in 18 months. We still have 2 vacancies. So we have been going in an incredible rate of work with an incredible amount of staff turnover. I'll touch a bit more on that. But not only that, the budget, when it was approved, was around the $12 million mark for capital works. We then got nearly, and that had a good chunk of grant money already in it. We then got another nearly $8 million worth of grant funding on top of that. So that was kind of, then add in the market conditions. It's a perfect storm of how do you actually deliver all of this work? And it did come down to a huge prioritisation process. And the figures on this screen, I'm not glowing with pride at what the numbers are, but in honesty, I'm gobsmacked at what we did manage to do last year. And we did focus on getting those renewals done because that is our core business. We need to make sure we're on top of our renewals. And you know what? We did delay the bridges because of a couple of strategic reasons. But we actually did our renewals under budget as well. So we did some really competitive procurement work last year. And that is another really, a gold star for the staff who were working on it because, again, the climate isn't always to get lower prices at the moment. Out of all of our projects, and we had 86 projects, again, for context, 45% of those were in completion phase. So not quite half, but nearly half were done. And of the 30% that were still in implementation phase, almost so many of them were so close to being finished. So we've now nearly finished almost all of those. And typically it was either due to a delay in procurement or contractor availability on through the procurement process. Or for a couple of projects, and it's been the playground renewals in particular, we've actually extended out our engagement process to really try and make sure we're delivering what the community want on those playgrounds. So there's been reasons for those having delays. Now, the 20% that we had still in design phase, I must admit most of them were grant-funded projects where, it's really important that we've prioritised those because they've got delivery timeframes that we have to meet, and there's actually a whole heap of external review points that we have to meet as well. But typically what we've done is we have split those into design and construction, and so some of that big carry forward is that pushing out of the construction phase budget. We only had 5% of projects that really didn't move at all last year, and they were largely due to waiting for other level of government documentation or stamps of approval to even proceed. So quite minor. Do you want to go to the next slide, Sharon? So look, I don't want to harp on it. I think you already know. It was just a hard slog to get. We're so grateful to get all that extra money and deliver all these fantastic assets for our community, but we do need to do it right, and it takes people. And so that resourcing constraint and recruitment complexities, it's hard to get good staff at the moment. Engineers, project managers, contract managers, they are in high demand, and the private sector does pay a lot more than local government. There's been a huge movement in the industry. But that doesn't mean then that council wants to recruit people who don't fit into the team and who don't help us. We need to have people who hold the same values and who do want to deliver for community. So getting the right person does have to come over just getting a person to get the job done. So that's something else we've had to manage. And the civil building and open space market conditions have just been crazy. And for anyone who knows someone who's been building a house, the delays and cost escalation is just the common story. And again, procurement we've had to take extra care in procurement because there's instability in the market as well. We don't want to put ourselves in positions when we're engaging contractors who, might go bust and leave us in even worse situations. So, there's lots of checks and balances that we do. There's also complexity in project decision making. I mean, have a look at all those resolutions for just 2 projects there. So the Carpathian Reserve upgrade process, I mean, we collectively, everyone in this room, I know probably the newer council members not so much, but people who've been on last council as well, it's been a journey to get that project to where it is. And likewise for the Aquatic Centre filtration and heating, I mean, the decision, trying to work out whether we were going to do both filtration and heating upgrade actually did delay a lot of our ability to go and finalise design and then procure. And the fact that we're still trying to get that done in this pool season closure is, that I've got to say, that's due to a lot of great staff doing very hard work behind the scenes. So, they're the influencing factors. I think we're starting to turn the corner, but you might all say that I'm ever the optimist on that one.
I might go to Councillor Hennessy had something she wanted to say.
Well, no, just as the person who put this up, I have to stress that 2 things. I put the word perception in there because I think what's happened since that comment and an earlier comment that were we inadvertently providing pressure on staff by having this expectation, the communications increased. What both you, Wendy, and Sharon have said tonight has helped. We need to understand what the challenges are. That communication that's occurred is helping us to understand what's happening, which helps us then explain to the community the reasons for this. I'm particularly heartened by the idea that we'll start to put out to more realistic timelines, because that seems very sensible and certainly what the private sector does. And Sharon, you're going to have to put it in bold letters on something. We have to be mindful of discipline priorities, both as staff and elected members. I think maybe we should just have that on the wall constantly, because from my point of view, I think there is without that discipline, I'm sensing that the community is starting to feel that some of this grant money that we get, and hey, listen, never going to knock back grant money in as a concept, but it's actually starting to work against our long-term financial plan. We're being showered sometimes with grants, which are never 100%. We have to contribute towards it. I think there's a sense that they're interrupting what we would like to achieve in an orderly fashion. So that balance between taking what we can get, but making sure it's what we, as the community, want to do in a logical and expected way, and not get gazumped with, oh, look, here's a shiny thing, go off and do this. That was my concern. But basically, I'm really pleased that communication, Wendy, you've got nothing to apologise. I think you're doing some fabulous work. I think we all agree to that. We just need to have that information to reassure members of the community who get a bit sometimes.
I think that's right. You are doing really, really good work, and I think having that explanation that you lost 80% of your staff is not easy. It's actually quite challenging. So I think that given that where was the previous slide, 13% under budget, excellent work. And 20% of projects are in design phase, 45% of projects are in completion phase, 85 projects, I think that's what you said, 85? So I think that now's an opportunity for us to actually congratulate staff on their work, because 85 projects is not easy to deliver in 12 months. I think that's quite reasonable, and when you lose 80% of your staff, you've still got 2 positions that you need to fill. However, I'm sure you will fill them with wonderful staff that fit the organisation. So I think it's appropriate that we provide positive feedback to the executive team, all of the executive team, and you, Sharon, as well, who is the keeper of the coin. Yes. Well, I think that's important because you have a very important role to guide the elected members on fiscal policy. And I think that long-term outcomes, and I think Helen's right, you know, we get these grants and it sort of pushes through, and then we add extra money and that actually affects our bottom line. I think that we can actually do better than that. I think that, you know, what is it that we're prepared to partner? How much should we be partnering to ensure that, you know, we get the good outcome? But sometimes I think we add too much. And sometimes we're doing state government projects where we shouldn't be doing them. So, you know, like there's a couple of projects that staff are managing and they are state government projects. And I'm a little bit concerned that we're doing state government work when state government should be doing that work.
All right, so I do think, you know, it's really important that we learn as we go through, and like, you know, we didn't, like for all the, you know, I'm proud of what we did, you know, we can do better. And this is part of managing that expectation. And so I think it really is critical that we identify properly multi-year projects at the budget bid phase. And I think we started to do that a bit better in the last round of budgets. That said, now within the fullness of time, having actually gone through the more detailed scoping and procurement planning for all those projects, I'll give you the heads up now. Q1 budget review report will provide an update of projects which we're now identifying will go out over multiple years, just so that everyone's on the same page and some on the same page early in the financial year. I think there's always, and Sharon's been through lots of the budget bid story, but I think there's always improvements we can do in this space. So the timely review of unit rates, which we use to cost up our renewal projects in particular. So that's a really critical thing for us to do early and get right, because it actually allows us to deliver the full scope of work. And I guess the thing that isn't up there, but that then links to actually putting up renewals that are coordinated with our latest asset condition data. So we've done a new method of transport asset condition assessment over the last couple of months. So it's all high-tech stuff, so we're going to get everything back. You know, it was cars and cameras, and it's all magically assessed by people who do this for 75% of the councils across Australia. They come up with a renewal program, and that will help us revisit what needs to go into our asset management plans, but also our long-term financial management plan as well. So getting that right means we are putting the right amount of money and effort into our renewals. For major projects, getting that independent cost estimation is critical, and I do want to have the discipline of seeing that going into budget bid phase, noting that we got some independent cost estimates done over the last year, and within 6 weeks they were 25% out. So, you know, look, market, you know, how you manage a market which is moving at a pace that no one expects is something that we've still got to get our head around, and how we put enough contingency around them. And it's also about having the right and considered indexing to take account for that. In terms of resource planning, when I say internal resourcing is best there, this is my personal view, but it is demonstrated to me time and time again. I'm talking there about internal project management is best. There are some absolutely wonderful external project managers, and in a bind they can come in and work wonders. However, the loss of corporate knowledge and managing the risk of them moving on in the middle of a project means in some ways you've actually got duplication of project management, because someone in the team still needs to be being across it. I stand by at the moment my view that internal resourcing in some aspects for smaller civil projects is also the way to go, and I can demonstrate that right now for you in the Murray Street South car park work we're doing. To try and get a contractor to do it was going to cost double and take a lot longer. My guys are out there doing it right now. They're adjusting their own program of works to fit it in. They're nimble, they're good at their job. So that, I think, you know, capitalising on that is important. I do have to manage workload to prevent staff burnout and turnover, because the more burnt out the staff get, the more likely they are to leave, which then causes it just exacerbates all your issues. But the other thing is that the more burnt out your staff are, the more mistakes start to happen, because when they're exhausted, they're humans, and for every mistake, it's even more effort. So, managing those staff is so important. Discipline with monthly cash flow review and making sure that it's up to date. So we've got the early warning signs if something is going to go over its program is critical. I will be enforcing that discipline. And again, this is more, we do a lot of this identification, I guess, within our own teams and our project management governance group, but making sure there's a way of reporting this up to the chamber as well. And it's that early identification of changing delivery conditions. And it might be design changes due to a whole suite of different conditions. It might be that stakeholder or community expectations are changing and we need to provide more time to get it right, and obviously market conditions which are outside of our control as well. So I guess they're the key things I've really picked up on in the last 12 months. I'm sure I will learn even more over the next 12 months and many years, but it's my intention to keep us getting better and better.
All right, so the next topic was depreciation, and I'll try my best to actually try and explain this in a way that makes sense. I might be having this conversation multiple times because I've had it multiple times over my years in this role, these sorts of roles. So in short, depreciation basically represents the apportionment of the asset cost over its life. And the rate of depreciation reflects basically how much the item value is decreasing. And the purpose why we actually do depreciation is, from a financial perspective, is actually to calculate how much the asset's worth after a certain period of time. Because, even though we like to think that we're going to be all nice, new and shiny forever, just everyone knows that not everything or everyone becomes nice, new and shiny and valuable forever. So basically it's just calculating that cost. And then it's also giving us an indication from an asset management planning perspective as to sit there and say at what point do we think that we actually need to replace that asset as well. So there is a bit of intertwine. And it's also making sure that the cost of the asset is actually recovered from people who consume the benefits of the assets. Because most assets, we actually borrow money, so we basically go out and fund that from a borrowings or essentially a cash reserve. That's actually one big hit, so depreciation makes sure that realistically it's an essentially what I would sort of sit there and say potentially it's a user pay system, that the people that are getting the benefits or the people that are using up that asset are actually paying for it by the fact that we've actually got this depreciation charge on our income statement. And then by recognising that accumulated depreciation on the balance sheet, we actually know how much value is left in that asset before we need to replace it. Bearing in mind that if you actually do maintain an asset well, effectively that asset might have a longer engineering life than it would actually from an economic life.
So just if we can bring it down to an example of, like, let's say a single stretch of footpath or something. When you say depreciation for that, so you're determining how much it's worth, and by that you mean how much it will cost to replace it, or like, okay, examples would be good.
And obviously in a perfect world, our asset renewal spend would actually equal our annual depreciation, because that's effectively saying that we're actually renewing assets at the rate that they're deteriorating. So just to try and explain it, so I've chosen a playground. So essentially a playground costs $100,000, so that's actually either funded by money in the bank if you've got some money, or borrowings or grant funding, or a combination of both. So there's actually a big initial cash outlay. We say that A playground, obviously, collectively, I'll say, lasts for 20 years. So effectively, the people that are using that asset will actually derive a benefit over the next 20 years. From a playground perspective, what we actually sit there and say that the use of that playground will actually be equal over that 20 years. Obviously, there's some assets where potentially you would sit there and say that you might accelerate it. Obviously, a new cars depreciate at a higher rate and then go down. But pretty much most of our assets, we sit there and say effectively, pretty much we will use a straight line method. So whatever the useful life, we will actually recognise that in equal amount. So then our depreciation charge is $5,000 a year. So we would actually put, effectively that's our annual charge for everyone in the community who actually uses those for the benefit of actually using the playground or having the playground available for their use. So as I say, so the concept is that you charge $5,000 per annum for the period that it's expected. So it is a notional user charge. Obviously, we don't charge for the use of our playground, but that effectively is how you can actually relate to it. It's just a fee. And then theoretically, over the 20-year time frame, you've actually recovered the cost of that asset, and then you will actually it will have no value, and then you'll actually have some money, all things being equal, in the bank to actually pay for the replacement of that asset.
Yeah, I'll go. So in terms of, so when you say it's value, are we talking about, I guess, a theoretical value to the community as opposed to like the first year the playground's worth $100,000, the next year you could sell it for, $950,000, or is it just understanding that?
So obviously all our assets, from a community assets perspective, you would sit there and say that there's no active market for it. So we wouldn't actually apply a market value. So what we actually need to do then is effectively, so the initial cost is initially recognised at cost. And then as we go through, depending on the asset, so normally from a playground perspective, what we will then do, every 5 years we're required to actually go through a valuation process. And what that valuation process does is basically restates the cost of that asset based on where its point in its life, and revalue that at what it would cost to actually replace that asset. So there is actually an indexation factor. So normally, and that's pretty much what the condition assessment does. So what we actually do there is every 5 years we will actually go out and do a condition assessment of our roads, footpaths and curbs. They will actually have that condition, and based on that condition they will determine what the life of that asset is, and then we'll actually apply that unit rate to determine what the written down replacement cost of that, and then effectively we will restate the depreciation charge based on that factor and all that sort of stuff. So it's not, so I would sit there and say very rarely, and even assets like our building assets, most of them are on community land, so it is quite difficult just to sell them in the active market. So most of our assets are basically put at the written down replacement value.
Thank you for that explanation, but what I really want to dig down is how does that depreciation amount then get used? Understand that it doesn't get put into a separate account and isolated in 10 years' time when we need to rebuild the hall. What I'm trying to do is understand the link between depreciation and the maintenance of these assets, because I think in our community we've inherited a lot of old assets. And some of them have been brought up to speed and are reasonably well maintained, and some haven't. And that's what's giving us grief from the community. So perhaps you could just take us through what happens with the use of depreciation.
Yep. So effectively, essentially, because it's a user pays, so what we're actually doing is to sit there and say, so the depreciation that we actually charge to our balance sheet, our income statement, which effectively we use to calculate to determine our rates income, is actually used to actually fund the renewal program. So the renewal works, so the capital renewal program isn't actually funded by borrowing. Like, we shouldn't be borrowing money to actually deliver that work. So we should actually be using the depreciation or the cash that we generate, because depreciation is obviously a non-cash item. So the cash that we generate through our operating activities should actually be then used to actually fund those investment activities, which predominantly is our renewal program. So we shouldn't be in a position where we actually need to borrow. Obviously, our renewal program at the moment is probably less than that $8 million charge. So what we're actually using, potentially we're using that depreciation charge at the moment, contributing to our deficit that we've actually got. So from a recurrent perspective, we've actually got a deficit position based on the rating decisions. So realistically, if you actually look at the recurrent budget section without all the new initiatives, what you actually want to make sure is, from a cash perspective, you actually got a surplus equivalent to what, at a minimum, what your actually renewal program is. So we've got a $3 million civil infrastructure renewal, so our ideal is that we should actually have around about a $3 million operating surplus on our recurrent budget. Because effectively the cash that we're collecting, we're using to actually fund those renewals and to replace those assets as we actually go through, when they're actually due to be replaced. So that's the ideal world. We know that that's not the ideal world, and we know that, and potentially in some situations where your renewal budget is not as high, and you may use that depreciation funding to actually offset some of the borrowing requirements for upgraded assets as well. So, so the best scenario is, if you're not using all your depreciation on your renewal program, you're actually using it to actually offset the borrowings required to assets.
I think the perception of the community is we do a lot of that. We don't renew our assets. We don't have a rigorous and well-implemented renewal process. We are using depreciation to offset our bottom line, and maybe that's because we keep driving ourselves through, rates. So we're our own worst enemies. But there's no point building new assets around this town if we're still lagging with all these old ones, because that's, as I said before, giving us a lot of grief from the people who are using those assets.
Thank you, Sharon. Mayor Karen. You mentioned something there before that was about the fact that you spend $100,000 on the playground, and we've got 5 of them around here, so we've got $500,000 in playgrounds, but you don't classify it as an asset. But we classify a tree as an asset. I can't seem to get my head around that. And when is, I don't know whether we've got an asset manager, we probably have, and that sort of thing. When does it come to us as a council or an asset manager to say that that playground's not being used, so why should we replace it? For instance, we had one over Gawler South there that we didn't replace, and so forth, and no one kicked up, sort of thing. We're now building a new one in Reed Reserve, another $100,000, but it's not an asset. So who is it that comes to the point where, look, I don't think we'll rebuild that and spend another $100,000. We'll do something else with that money, put a footpath down past Cody's place or something like that. When does it come to that point? And it's a little bit also like the parks. I live up, as you know, on Hemmerford Drive, and we've got a magnificent park up there. The only people that use it are the dogs when they do puppies. And it is fantastic. There's a brand new playground there that was burnt. We'd never heard, but it looks beautiful again. There's only one thing wrong. We don't see kids playing on it. And a very observant person that lives straight opposite says to me sometimes, I'm really surprised that we did such a beautiful playground, but kids aren't playing on it. I go past it regularly and there's none there. I mean, when does it come to the point of it being an asset and a tree's an asset but a playground's not, and we spent 100 grand on it?
I don't know. So a playground is an asset and it is considered an asset. So effectively, all our playgrounds would be on our asset register. Asset in the financial sense of the fact that the life of it is going to be greater than 12 months. It might not be an asset to the community, obviously, because no one uses it. So, so I suppose it's what your definition of an asset. We don't capitalise trees. So effectively, yes, trees are a community asset. Trees have value. So I suppose it's your definition of what an asset is. Most people would associate that trees have value, so they're an asset to the community, but we don't capitalise them. We do put a notional value on them when we're actually talking about that from a community perspective, but they're not on our balance sheet. Obviously, the decision whether to we replace an asset when it comes to its useful life is obviously, that comes in our asset management planning. So we do our condition assessments. We see that an asset might be coming to the end of its useful life, and that's when that decision as to whether we actually replace it for a like, we don't replace it, or we actually upgrade it. So those decisions are made from an asset management planning through Wendy's team. And obviously, if you're going to do something new, potentially that would actually come up through the renewal program or potentially the upgrade program in each of the annual budget processes, and then when you've got your review of your asset management plan. So obviously, if we didn't charge it, so effectively every single time we replaced an asset, we'd actually have the financial hit because if we're not depreciating, if we're not apportioning the cost over the life of the asset, we're sitting there saying we're actually going to expense it. We say that it actually only has 12 months. The reason why we don't that, yep. It's on one page. It's on the same page. I flicked it over. It was a bit too small on the screen, so I split it up.
I'm just wondering about big assets. For example, Schronberg Drive, we've got to depreciate that. Obviously, we're using some of that money to do renewals. What are we going to do whenever we need to replace Schronberg Drive?
So obviously, the same we do with any other asset. So effectively, depending on what the components are. So obviously, Schronberg Drive is a big asset. Normally what we actually do from a civil perspective is actually break them out into two segments rather than actually do the whole replacement all at one point in time. So it's no different. We'll put it on the asset management plan effectively and we'll schedule, obviously, and then we actually have the 5-year condition assessment. So potentially we might, if it deteriorates more quickly than what we actually anticipated based on, I suppose, it's as-built specifications, then we'd actually accelerate or de-accelerate and bring it forward. But realistically, yes, we're depreciating it, but so over that life, we say roads probably have around about 100-year life, so over that 100 years, we'll charge everyone, and theoretically, we've collected that cost, and then when we actually go back, we've got money.
If it becomes a collector road, then there's an argument to send it back to the state government. Now, that's not easy to do because they will push back and say, oh, it's a local road. But if it's a collector road and if it's used as a collector road from the southern Barossa, from Balmoral Road straight through, then there is an argument to test that argument.
And to be fair, we do get state and federal government money for road maintenance.
Much. We don't get a lot.
Oh, well, beg to differ, but anyway.
No, we don't get a huge amount. We get roads to recovery and we get a special local roads because South Australia has argued very strongly to the federal government to be able to get that extra money, but we don't get a huge amount. We do apply for through state government and federal government for grant money, and that's probably more lucrative than roads to recovery.
So the grant money that we receive is generally just for maintenance, not necessarily asset renewal. So obviously, so we get a roads component of our financial assistance grants, and then we got the supplementary component, and then we got roads to recovery, which we have a choice. So you can actually use that on a capital project, but I think what we actually use that is actually we offset that from our maintenance cost perspective. So. Obviously, the variability revaluation actually does have a variability on our assets. Like at the moment, technically, based on current prices, we should be revaluing our road assets between 50 to 20%. I would question again. There's not an actually active market for our roads. Is this increase just basically a bit of an aberration, and then by the time it will come back? So that's basically a decision that we need to actually come through, as to sit there and say what's actually an appropriate increase in the asset value, considering that a lot of these assets are 80 to 100 years old life, and all that sort of stuff as well. So we do have to make that big decision, because potentially we might have a 20 to 25% increase in the unit rates this year. So we actually revalue recast our depreciation, and then 18 months later, effectively the unit rates come back to normal and we have a 20% reduction in the value. So then we have a reduction in our value that has a flow-on impact to our depreciation. So it is a bit of a, with that respect, it is a bit of a science. It's a bit of a feel as to where we think that the market's going. I hate to think that it's going to keep continually to increase at these rates. And then obviously the assessment of our useful lives. So once we actually do the condition assessment, we actually may reduce the life of particular assets if their conditions are actually bad. And then we've got the fact that we actually have an increase in our asset base. Developers, so the developers, as they develop lands, they build the roads, they build the footpaths, they build the parks and reserves, and effectively when then they walk away and then they just give it to us, and we've got this asset, like, yep, we haven't paid for it, but we're actually left with the burden of having to maintain that and replace that in the future. But yeah, so realistically, from a depreciation perspective, we should be trying to get ourselves into a position where that is actually funding our renewal program and making a contribution to any new and upgraded assets, rather than actually funding, I suppose, general maintenance, because it is depreciation should be your I suppose you're funding for that replacement of that asset, rather than just maintaining that asset in fixing the pothole or cleaning the street. Okay. Yep.
and she can keep going with her long-term financial planning.
I have information here, but effectively I just figured that I'll just put it there for your information and you can refer to it. So obviously we do have to have a series of strategic management plans that are required by the Act, and we are going through a process where we have to actually review these. So in particular, we have to review the Community Plan 2030, which David has commenced doing that review, and then we'll actually have the infrastructure and asset management plans, which basically work has commenced on that, and that's because the condition assessment stuff is actually one of the key inputs into that. So once we actually have a lot of that data, we will go through the asset management plan, and we actually do have to have the long-term financial plan. So we'll probably be having a few sessions on these issues, so I pretty much won't go into the War and Peace, but I just still provided that information into you for the pack. One thing I think it's just important to sort of understand how that there's effectively all these things interlink, and that's the important thing that we actually need to make sure in our mindset when we're actually looking at, like, the asset management plan, the community plan, the long-term financial plan, and the annual budget and the annual business plan, and even our service plans and any other plan that comes up for review or consideration. We actually need to make sure that we actually can think about them in a holistic manner rather than actually individually, because they all interrelate. Because either the policy plans and strategies effectively will potentially feed into our asset management plan or actually our service plans. Our community plan, which is our overarching, sets the directions for the basis for the development of all those plans. And then obviously it also comes back from a financial management perspective into our long-term financial plan that then effectively takes into our annual business plan. So I just thought it's really important, coming into this next budget cycle, and then when we're actually doing the review of all our plans, thinking about it in that holistic and how they all interrelate to each other. Again, yep, sorry, Helen.
No, I was just going to say the last paragraph on page 14 is the point that I asked it as a bit of a Dorothy Dix. It's if we decide to not go with the long-term financial plan, all we're doing is shuffling the debt forward.
Oh, we have to. It's in the legislation.
Yeah. But if we, for example, drop our rate, the recommended rates, then we're going to have to increase it in another year. Either that or stop spending in some area. I think it goes back to just being conscious of we're not doing this on a year by year. We're looking at a plan that goes across 10 years, and so we have to be mindful.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
But we are required to do a long-term financial plan.
Yeah, so we are required, and I think I tried to make that emphasis is to sit there and say you can't think about the decisions that you make from an annual budget perspective in isolation. It's not a one-year decision that you're actually making. You're actually making because there are implications for going forward as to what those decisions that you actually make today. Because again, yes, if you spend a lot of money this year on a lot of new projects, effectively there will be a period of time where you actually don't have the capacity to actually do some major projects. Again, if you actually make decisions from an operating perspective, they do have implications for even our capacity, even though our capital budget is different from our operating budget, but it does have that capacity for us to actually be able to borrow in the future, because we still need to have that cash to service it, because you don't want to be in a position where you're borrowing money to pay back borrowings. We have. So I'll just flick through this. This is pretty much a repeat of the information that was provided to you probably, I think, in the first 3 weeks of you, especially of the new term. So I get it. It probably went over everyone's head, but we will actually be revisiting this again probably within the next couple of months anyway, when we have to start thinking about the budget and the annual long-term financial plan, which this year we'll actually be doing concurrently in that major review. These are just pretty much the outcomes again. and even when we're considering these, our KPIs, we actually also need to consider what the impact of, what the impact of that deficit that we're actually got for 23-24, what actually means that, how that actually impacts on our rate increase, so, in relation to rate increases, obviously, so with the local government reform, now one of the elements of the new long-term financial plan is we have to actually have a separate funding plan. So which is actually which is a new concept. So those decisions about our rate revenue increases actually need to, be considered, be thoughtful in the context of, what does it mean if we actually have an operating deficit? What does it mean if we have low rate increases for particular years? What does it mean actually on our net financial liabilities? And as a growth council, we actually also need to turn our mind to what the impact of actually our growth is, So obviously new development creates new revenue. And sometimes there's a bit of a thinking, oh, well, I'm getting all this new revenue. That new revenue needs to actually fund the services that is actually increasing, the increase in our services that is required to actually maintain those new assessments. So we have a whole new fundamental variable services that we will actually have to provide, because that new development comes with new reserves. So we actually have to maintain them. So we have, reserve maintenance. We have street sweeping because there's new streets, additional roads that we have to sweep. We have more street lighting. So we actually have an increase in our street lighting bill. So that's what that new revenue that comes out of those new assessments is actually there designed to fund. It's not necessarily to offset, I suppose, our existing services, because basically what happens if we take that, I suppose sometimes it's a bit of an easy option. Over time, our existing services and then any additional services actually become underfunded. So we do need to think about that from a holistic perspective. Obviously, and then you've got your asset management. If you actually, the idea is to maintain, we have an asset management plan, so the idea is to make sure that we're actually renewing our assets at the same rate of what we actually said that, that we're actually be doing. And then again, obviously, if we have deficits, we have to fund those deficits some way. And realistically at the moment, that $1 million deficit that we're actually funding, we're funding that through borrowings, because we don't have the cash to actually, or we don't have the cash reserves to actually sustain that deficit. So realistically, we're potentially we are borrowing to actually open up the doors. And the other thing that we need to have in the back of our mind going into this year, this budget cycle, and even our long-term financial plan, is 24-25 we're actually subject to what they refer to as the Strategic Management Plan Advice Scheme, which basically is the ASCOSA review. And that's where it basically looks at all our documents, what we're actually communicating in those documents, our long-term financial plan, our asset management plan, even our annual budget, and what we've actually, so what we're communicating out to the community, and our performance against that, and realistically how we are performing. And the idea is that realistically is the community getting value for money for the services that we're providing, and the rates that we're actually collect through that. And they do look back. Basically, they'll look back at our results for the last 10 years. They'll look at our annual business plans. They'll look at the long-term financial plans, and they'll make an assessment as to sit there and say how well, as an organisation, have we actually delivered on what we said that we were going to deliver on. Then to make a forward assessment as to whether we will actually, what we're telling the community is realistic and actually is providing them value for money. So, and we're due for the 24-25 budget. but again, as we go through the planning process, we'll have another session on that. So the last bit I want to talk about is rates. Rates is another probably topic that's like depreciation. People sort of generally understand the concept, but they don't necessarily understand how it works, and all that sort of stuff. So realistically, as our organisation, the budget is an iterative process, so effectively we do have to come back and forth. We will make changes. We'll never get it right first time around, and we'll have to actually make some sacrifices, and we'll have to make some hard decisions. But as an organisation, and we're committed to actually providing a large number of services. And while some of those services, like the pool, are sort of partially set up on a user pay principle, most of our services that we provide are actually in response to a local government act, legislation, or a community interest and expectation. We actually don't, we're not like a commercial operation where we actually sit there and charge a fee, and that fee is based on a cost recovery basis. So our budget is expenditure driven. That's the stuff that we actually realistically have the control over. So it is expenditure driven rather than revenue driven. So we don't have contracts linked back to our income. We don't have people wanting to come and do our services. And so realistically, rate revenue is the balancing figure, because that's the hole that we actually need to fill, and what we fill it with is our rates revenue. Yes, Cody? Oh. And so obviously our ultimate goal is to make sure that we can actually have an operating surplus. Our target at the moment is between 5%, 0 to 5% on a rolling basis. And again, that's actually making sure that that operating surplus isn't just to build up cash reserves. That operating surplus is making sure that we can actually service our debt effectively. We have cash reserves that we can actually withstand economic conditions without actually having to have sharp rate increases. So it is managing that expectation from the community as to sit there and say how much they will actually get charged. And I know that there's been a lot of criticism to sit there and say, oh, okay, well, you went through the budget, and when we are told that, the expenses, reduction of expenses was going to come off the rates, that is not how our budgets are developed. Effectively, the expenditure that, when you're in operating deficit position, the expenditure you save should actually be focusing on reducing that deficit. So we actually have the cash that we can actually do what we actually want to do, and bring forward and potentially deliver some of those community expectations and those big assets earlier than previously. And the only way you change rates is by changing your rate revenue, so realistically like that. So the calculation of rates is actually a byproduct of you determining what revenue you need and what expenditures. It's not, the charging of rates doesn't actually derive our rate revenue. Our rate revenue drives what our rate payable and rate collections are. Are you putting your hand up, or you're just stretching? I'm seeing movement. I'm seeing movements in the side, so I don't know whether you're asking questions. So how rates are collected. So once we've determined our bucket of rate revenue, what we actually need is that then it's actually divided by the capital value of all the properties within the council area to determine the rate in the dollar, and that rate in the dollar is actually used to distribute the collection of that rate revenue across the individual property owners. From a property valuation perspective, we actually adopt the property valuations as determined by the Valuer General, so we don't go out and do the valuations, the Valuer General does that. And the Valuer General determines the land use, and those properties and those values are done that. As I said, the property value is the the means that we use to distribute the rate revenue that we actually collect. And rate revenue isn't determined by the property values. So rate revenue is determined by what we actually need to actually fund the services and programs and new activities that we actually want to deliver during the year. And our rate in the dollars adjusted for the valuation increase, which is over and above the rate revenue increase that we actually need from our existing properties and new assessments. So what we actually have is effectively, you know, this is the back of the envelope calculation of the rate in the dollar. There's a few little things, but in simply terms. So we do have 3 differential rates. So we have our general rate, which basically applies to our residential ratepayers, and then our primary production and a few other properties, other rate classes. We have our commercial and industrial, and then we have our vacant land. So our commercial and industrial, we have a differential rate, so we actually charge them 2.46 times more than the general rate, and on vacant land we charge them 1.6 times. So what we actually do is, based on those rate in the dollars, we actually gross up the capital value, and so effectively the grossed up capital value of our properties for the 23-24 was $6.4 billion. And then we take our rate revenue, which we've determined that we actually want to collect, and this is actually gross rate revenue, and then to determine that rate in the dollar, and so that rate in the dollar becomes our general rate. Then what we actually do is basically that general rate we actually apply to the individual capital values. So effectively, and this one is just here to sort of demonstrate the impact of the capital, like the increase on the capital value and what that actually does to the rate in the dollar. So 22-23 we had 0.46 cents in the dollar. This year our general rate was 0.2. Capital value increased basically from the average value of a residential property increased from $374,000 to about $419,000. So that was around about a 14.5% increase. In the end, we actually only increased our rates payable for that average residential property by $53. And so that was actually made up into an increase in the increase resulting from that change in capital value from $374,000 to $419,000 was $208. But then we actually had that reduction in our rate in the dollar, so that actually brought that back by $155 to actually bring that to a 53%. And so for an average residential person, we actually had a 3%, they had a 3% increase in their rates payable. However, as you know, we had a 5% increase for our general rates, and then we had 2% of new revenue from our new assessment. So we had a 7% rate revenue increase, but effectively that translated back to a 3% increase for the average residential ratepayer. Yes, Cody?
So I guess just in terms of the average, because my question, I guess, was around just sort of understanding how it affects different, like if you're on the lower end, are you actually only getting a 1.5% increase in the rates when someone's getting 3% increase in the rate, or is it just that overall they're paying less rates because they're in that lower value?
Depends on how much their property value moved. So ultimately, so you would sit there and say that effectively if your property value moved, right, irrespective of what the value of your house, in generally, you would have said that you would have got a 3% increase in your rate. It wouldn't be $53, it would actually be 3%, because that's basically from a 14%. If you actually got an increase, so if your property value didn't increase only increased by 5%, then you would actually have a rate, the decrease in your rates payable from this year compared to last year would have actually decreased. But if you had like a 25 or 30% increase in your property value, the increase would actually be greater than 3%. So ultimately, it's a really hard question to sit there and say categorically lower income people are actually automatically going to get a lower increase, versus someone that's of high value, because ultimately it depends on how your property moves in relative terms to the general movement of that capital value. So it is a very difficult question. So some people might sit there and say, oh, okay, well, you know, you might have a property value that's gone from $150,000, which basically would have been charged the minimum rate, to say 270, and so they wouldn't actually necessarily have got a huge increase compared to last year, because this year they would have moved off the minimum rate, and it would be their capital value times the thing. So you would sit there and say potentially they might have actually only got like a $3 increase in their rates payable. So it's a individual basis, because rates is actually, or the property value is the one that is used to spread that rate revenue increase that we've actually got. So yeah.
So we've all been hit by the fact that the global housing market has driven up prices, but low income people are eligible and get concessions, don't they, from the state government? So on their rates, is that my understanding?
So effectively, so there used to be the pensioner concession, but then there's effectively the $200 assistance. I don't know what the eligibility criteria, but realistically that disappeared probably 6 or 7 years ago. But yeah, so pensioners there used to be a $200 pensioner rebate. I'm not quite sure, because obviously councils don't manage that cost of living adjustment anymore. That's done by the state government. I don't know whether it's across the board or whether it is just basically pensioner and lower income earners.
But it's important that concession be maintained by the state government and not passed to local government, is the point I'm trying to make. It is a state government, but I think whatever the changes, and I hadn't realised it had changed so much, but I get a feeling that our community is expecting us to fill that gap, and that's unfair. That's a transfer of responsibility.
Yeah, and I think the issue at the moment now, like previously, because effectively that rebate used to be coming back through your rates, it was actually quite visible. Whereas now I think what happens is that's an automatic payment into your bank account. You know, once you apply for it, you get that automatic attachment. So, you know, because people aren't physically seeing it now, they've probably forgotten. And again, yes, and I think it's probably been, you know, may even be 8 years or so that hasn't actually existed. So, and some people still remember, oh, I used to get a $200 rebate and I'm not getting that anymore, you know. But effectively it was never our rebate. It was always the state government. It's just that the state government uses local government a lot to collect charges for themselves.
So, sorry, Brian, you go ahead. I know a number of people that go into payment plans to pay their rates. It used to be 20%. It's gone down to under 10%. Is it 7 or 8% now, Sharon?
Yeah, last time I checked, it was around about that point of view. Yeah. And it's interesting, you know, so a lot of and that's a lot of what the low income earners do. And if you actually look at what our rate outstandings are, you know, you do find that those low income earners are actually probably better at managing their budgets than people that are actually high income earners. Because they ring up and they enter voluntary, you know, so voluntary payment plans. So we actually do have a lot of those people that enter voluntary payment plans.
So some people, I know one person who lost their job, went into a payment plan. He's still on a payment plan, but he now has a job and he prefers to be on a payment plan because it keeps him on track with his rates. And he came to council when he lost his job, and he said the council staff were really, really helpful and enabled him to pay his rates, which he wanted to do, and he was able to do that, and now he's continuing to do that, even though he has a really well-paid job. So some people choose to do that because it just fits with their budgetary processes. So yeah, and I think you're right. I think people who are on fixed incomes know how to manage money a lot better than sometimes people who are on very high wages. Not always the case, but yeah, it makes you really think about what you spend your money on. Brian?
Sharon, the emergency service tax, you know, so many people think that that goes into our revenue, and it doesn't. So on the point, say the hypothetical where, and in previous years, I haven't heard anything much in the last couple of years, but a lot of people just don't pay their rates, you know, when the whole rate notice is sent out. But the money forwarded onto the emergency levy, you know, piggy bank, and that's only done when people do pay their rates. Is that the case?
I think you're referring to the regional landscapes levy. So that's basically what's added, and we collect that. No, it's not. So effectively, even if a ratepayer hasn't paid their rates, we actually have a requirement to remit whatever our required collection is on a quarterly basis. So there has been some change in the legislation that effectively, obviously, there's provisions of the Act where we can sell people's houses or start those proceedings if there's greater than 3 years in arrears. So effectively, if there is some situations where there's particular ratepayers that are in arrears of greater than 3 years, we can then go back and claim that unpaid money from the government and all that sort of stuff. So we don't necessarily have to sell their house, but if we wanted to, we could actually start recovery processes. But that's actually only of the emergency services level. But so because that was one of the things that came out when every single time that they consult on whether the regional landscape levy should be collected via rates or state government should collect it themselves, is that councils are out of pocket, particularly when ratepayers don't pay their rates, because we have to actually remit our annual allocation or our annual collections on a quarterly basis back to the state government. So then, Cody, you sort of asked a question which was a bit obscure. So I was trying to sort of sit there and think, how do I actually explain this? Because essentially the answer is no, you can't, because effectively, so Cody's response was, how can you sort of make people that, I suppose, have this perception that they've got the capacity to pay more, to give that benefit to the people that potentially might not have as great a capacity to pay. Obviously, we do have a system in place where we have done that to a degree with our commercial and industrial, because we actually have an option of under Section 158 of the Act where we can actually make a special adjustment, but that special adjustment's applied on property value. So what we actually do is to sit there and say, so with all our commercial and industrial properties, we've given them a tiered rating, or put them into tiers, and then effectively we've given them a rebate. But the important thing is to sit there and say, actually, that is actually a rebate. So that is actually a cost to council. So, either by giving that rebate or increasing that to, I suppose, the lower end of town compared to the higher end of town, what you're actually doing is reducing the income that we are actually collecting. So you need to think about that as a cost, no different from any other costs that we actually incur. So realistically, because we determine, I suppose, the bucket of rate revenue that we need to actually fund the services that we actually are providing, and then we use the rate, the capital value, to distribute that. So the options are that you can actually do, obviously you can try and shift the burden away from potentially where you think that there's less capacity to pay, to those sectors that effectively that you think that have more capacity to pay. Normally that would sit there and say that, oh, okay, well, you know, the commercial sector has more of a capacity to pay than a residential sector, so you might potentially want to shift your rate burden to those sectors. You do that potentially by changing the differential, so you might actually increase the differential, you know, by effectively shifting. But it's interesting, you know, so capital value is used to that distribution because that is actually the proxy to sit there and say, okay, well, that is probably the only means or the only information that we actually have as a council that provides indicates the level of, I suppose, that capacity to pay. And it's also that thing about the fact it's fair and equitable, because basically a person that, you know, of equal property value will pay the same amount of tax, you know, or the same amount of rates, you know, and fundamentally we just need to get back is to sit there and say rates are a property tax, so it's linked to the property value. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so just on the previous slide, just looking at the differential rates. Forward a couple. Yeah, it's looking at the valuation range. So, you know, for example, is that something where we could say, all right, rather than 5 million being the cutoff for not getting a rebate, we'll make that 3 million, and then we'll make the adjustment, you know, 50% instead of 45% on the lower end. That's what I'm sort of was thinking about in terms of, you know, shifting the burden of rates and that sort of thing in a more socially just way, that kind of, is that something that's possible?
It's possible, but effectively it comes at a cost. Because what you're actually doing is to sit there and say that bucket of money that you're collecting from your commercial sector is still the same, right? But what you're actually sitting there saying is that I'm giving away more of it to the lower end of town.
Right, but you're taking more of it away from the higher end of town.
No. No, you're not, because effectively what you're actually doing is to sit there and say, so what you would say is that rather than 5 million, or if you sit there and you'd want to give that, you actually have to remove those, you have to reduce those bands.
So, like, for example, currently 5 million doesn't get a rebate.
Yep.
So if 3 million is the cutoff to not have a rebate, for example, there would be a bunch of properties between 3 and 5 million that we no longer have to pay a rebate to. That is an increase in our money, and then that's what I mean by offsetting it.
If in that situation, yes, you will. Yeah, if you're prepared to actually reduce that threshold, and then you would actually redistribute it. So at the moment, so the value of that, I suppose, rebate or adjustment that we're actually giving the commercial sector is about $1.2 million. So to not make sure that we're actually not worse off, you would still want to make sure that whatever your adjustments are, again, is actually doing, is equal to $1.2 million. But I suppose it's a question on, and then the decision is to sit there and say, okay, well, what's the definition of high end of town? Or who's got a greater capacity, you know, what, just because someone has a 5 million, you know, in theory, you know, the business has a $5 million and...
What if somebody's sitting on a $2 million property and they're on a pension? What about that?
So realistically, this is just in the commercial sector, so you'd find that that probably is not the
Well,
case.
you're talking about residents. You're talking.
No, this is in the commercial.
Well, I thought you were talking about a socially just for people at the lower end of town. So are you talking about residents or are you talking about commercial?
I mean, well, the theory applies generally, but in the example here, I was talking about the commercial valuation range situation there, because that's the example. But just as a general, what I wanted to bring up was we sort of just talk about rates as in, is the rate going to go up by 3% or 5%, but not, is it going to, are we going to give less of a rebate to the rich and more of a rebate to the poor? That kind of situation is something that I was wondering, to what extent is that legislation? To what extent is it something that we as an individual council have control over?
So from a rebate perspective, obviously there's certain, so obviously the council has an option to give a discretionary rebate subject to conditions. And those conditions are very quite strict. Obviously from a residential perspective, there's not necessarily, so most of those rebates are directed at organisations that are in particular sectors of, from a community service perspective that provide services to disadvantaged. So most of the discretionary rebates are there, and then you've got a bunch of rebates, mandatory rebates that you have to take. From a residential perspective, there's no real capacity to provide a rebate back to them. Obviously, there's conditions that we can actually do. So one of the things is to sit there and say, oh, okay, well, then effectively you can increase your differential. So you're actually moving the revenue that you're actually collecting from the residential sector and you're moving it over to the commercial sector. And so this is an example here that I've actually done. So, so this here's the one on your left is actually as per our budget. So effectively we're collecting around about 74% from our residential sector, 18% from our commercial, also 19% from our commercial and industrial. Our gross revenue is $27 million. We give about $1.2 million back in a rebate to those lower value commercial properties. So our net revenue is $26 million. So the mechanisms that we actually have to actually shift that rate burden is obviously our differentials. So this one here on the right, what I've actually done is to sit there and say I've increased the commercial differential to 3 times. From a pie perspective, effectively the pie is still the same, so we're still collecting $27.4 million. If we don't adjust, if we keep those same property thresholds that we actually had before to sit there and those adjustments, what we'd actually be doing is that we're actually going to be giving around about $1.5 million back to those commercials in those Section 158 adjustments. So to bring that back into kilter to actually make sure that effectively we're not worse off as a result of that shift, that's where you would have to actually reduce that top threshold to balance that out, to actually make sure that your rebate is around about $1.2 million. So to sit there and say from a if you want to move the burden away from or the collection component away from your residential, because you feel as though that they're the ones that are actually doing it harder and all that sort of stuff, the way you actually do that is actually change your differentials. And effectively, so you try and shift that. But then there's the offset about how then you manage that adjustment and that rebate that you've actually given from the commercial sector as well.
I hear what you say, but I actually think we'd be better off in looking at the mandated concessions, and I do believe the Local Government Association is doing some work on this, particularly around the definition of educational rebates, and I think that change has to be made at a federal level rather than a state level. So what a definition of a church is, basically, because there's some, certainly interstate, there's some very unusual organisations claiming the education rebate. But I also remember a discussion somewhere along in our budget cycle that there was some reviews being done here in Gawler, and I specifically remember, I think it was the Starplex commercial section and the Jockey Club, and there was a third one. How did we go? Are we still working on that, or...?
No, so effectively, so they were discretionary rebates that were granted many years ago. So that assessment was actually done, and effectively those rebates have been withdrawn because effectively they weren't eligible. You know, realistically, you know, the conditions, as I said, most of the discretionary rebates are the fact that it's either you're doing something specific in the health or the education or the community service, but it is that you're actually, what you're using the land is to provide services to the disadvantaged. You know, so that's about all the discretionary stuff. It's all about making sure that you're rebating to those ones that are helping the disadvantaged, so they can actually provide those services. So those rebates were removed this year from a discretionary perspective. With regard to the mandatory ones, obviously they're out of our control. We can't do anything. You know, we are required to do that, and yes, the sector as a whole is looking at it. And I know that the university merger is one of the things that they use in the first test case here in South Australia to actually reduce that mandatory rebate, especially in particular to the universities. Whether that extends back down through to the private schools and all that sort of stuff as well, because obviously a lot of those private schools are very wealthy. Like I know from a Norwood's perspective, when you've got St Peter's and PAC that are on, you know, prime land and lots of land and all that sort of stuff, and not making any contribution, it does seem a bit wrong and all that sort of stuff. So, but that's out of our control. We're required under the Act to do that, and until those changes, we're stuck. But yeah, so from a discretionary perspective, so it is that thing about the fact of, with the rebates, even these Section 158 adjustments, someone else is actually paying.
So thank you, and thank you for the work with those discretionary budgets. I'm going to put you on the spot. About how much did that adjustment or readjustment of save us or gain us, perhaps is a better word?
So it's around about $80,000.
We can expect correspondence from both those organisations challenging our position, yes.
If they're not eligible, they're not eligible. Exactly. They're not, you know, they have to follow the rules, and I think Sharon actually discovered that they were not eligible. So, so I guess we'll work through that over time. How are we going, Sharon?
So I'm pretty much done. So in the short, I think it is, you know, obviously, again, it's that bucket and it's how we distribute it. So if you take it off here, someone else is paying, you know, it's not, or we're losing out effectively, and then you're behind the eight ball, because effectively if you're giving it back, you're effectively, it's just an expense that you're actually giving back and putting that extra cost onto us as a council to deliver services or not to deliver services, and to review services and all that sort of stuff as well. So,
well, thank you, Sharon, and thank you, executive team and Henry. Thank you, elected members. I think we'll call it a night. There's lots of nice reading here for your, you know, reading pleasure. Yeah, so... There's been a document out for tomorrow, an accumulation of the boundary. I haven't seen anything. I haven't seen a thing. Where was it? There was an email that came out, I think, published to the Big Hub, which was an accumulation of all the boundary, history of boundary stuff. Did I get that? I'm just trying to... Did Susie put it up, or...? I don't...
So yes, the document was loaded to the hub on Friday by Sarah Priest. It was alluded to in the communique
on
sent to members
Friday,
on
was it?
Thursday.
Friday?
So on Thursday, the communique went out saying that the document would be loaded by close of business Friday, which occurred on Friday by Sarah Priest. To boundary reform. It's just all the past reports and attachments related to boundary reform, a nice 720 odd pages
So
worth.
where is that? Is that on the notice board or?
It
Where?
is. Bear with me.
Where?
Bear with me and
Whereabouts?
I'll find it. It is on the general reading tab.
The general reading tab?
Yep.
It's not on the council member notice board?
No, it's on the general reading tab.
Right, okay. Okay. So we don't know that it goes on the general reading tab, or do we know that?
The hub notification sends a link to it direct to your email. So the email that came from the hub that said Sarah Priest has loaded a document, you click that link and it takes you straight there.
Doesn't open. Oh, I've got a... It doesn't open. I have to put my email address and my password in. It doesn't open. So it doesn't actually go straight. It doesn't go straight to the thing.
The communicate thing, and I thought, shit.
Yeah. Well, mine doesn't go straight. I have to put in all my email and password, and I don't want to do that. Well, I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to do that.
There should have been an email saying, this is for Wednesday night.
So explanatory.
So you should, so I think sometimes what you need to do is it logs yourself out.
No, every time I go through that story, I have to put my